Are we seeing the rise of a new McCarthyism in the United States? For those of you not old enough to remember, and I'm not old enough to remember, actually, back in the 50s, there was a guy by the name of Joe McCarthy who was going, I have in my hand a list of communists in the State Department. And turned out he was just a run-of-the-mill Republican alcoholic, but he created some serious damage in this country. And it wasn't obviously just Joe McCarthy. It was basically, bottom line here, and by the way, this is nothing new. In the election of 1800, there were charges from some people on the Jefferson camp that because John Adams had defended a British soldier back before I think it was in 1774 in the Boston Massacre, he actually was the defense lawyer, that he was therefore, devoted to the crown. Now, this did not come from Jefferson himself. He was appalled by it, but that was one of the charges. So, and there's always been demagoguery as part of the American political landscape, but it seems to ebb and flow. We seem to go through cycles where it gets worse and it gets better, and it seems to get worse the worse the economy is or the tighter the politics are. And I wanted to get Peter Beinart on here. He's written a piece called "The New McCarthyism." He is the senior political writer for the Daily Beast, a contributor to the Time magazine, the Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. His latest book, The Icarus Syndrome, History of American Hubris, and we've discussed this before, newamerica.net, the website. And Peter Beinart, welcome back to the program.
Nice to be here.
And great to have you. The new McCarthyism. Give me the story here.
I think if you look at the circumstance, we think about McCarthyism as a kind of demagogic, paranoid attack on a whole group of people based on the idea that they're a threat to the national security of the United States. But the point I was trying to make, and so I think we are seeing that vis-a-vis Muslims in the United States today, but the point I wanted to make beyond that was that if you look at the moment when McCarthyism has flared up, the early 1950s with McCarthy himself, but also 1919 and 1920, which was the first Red Scare, the first kind of panic about communists at home in the United States, which led to the deportation and harassment of a lot of labor union activists, a lot of immigrants. It tends to come at a time when America has been involved in wars, but is also feeling very tired and disillusioned by those wars. It's a confluence of war and isolationist sentiment. And I think that's my best attempt at understanding why this Islamophobia is emerging now and not more than it did, for instance, right after 9/11 itself.
Right. Well, right after 9/11, there was, at least over the short term, there was, I think, a general consensus, both in the Muslim world and in the United States, that this was not an attack by Islam and that this didn't have that much to do with Islam, that this was this guy Osama bin Laden, who was basically a cult leader. He had 20,000 followers at the most and, was trying to become a big shot. And, the tragedy, of course, is that George Bush made him a big shot. He turned him into Lex Luthor so that George Bush could play Superman. And now over time, demagogues like Newt Gingrich have tried to generalize this to all of Islam, as if, for example, the attacks of the IRA against the British government somehow meant that the entire, all Catholics in the world were terrorists or something like that.
Yeah, I think part of it was that Bush, for what all the negative things that we can say about him, actually was pretty straightforward after 9/11, saying that he did not think that Islam was the problem. I think a lot of conservatives from the very beginning did think that Islam was the problem, but that tamped it down a little bit. But I also think that what Bush did was led America into this crusade to change and conquer the Muslim world. And so he essentially focused the enemy outside our borders, in Saddam Hussein and the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think what's happened is, as Americans, not only on the left but on the right, have gotten basically sick of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they've basically decided to turn their focus inward. And this is always, I think, part of what McCarthyism is about. McCarthyites always say, why are we spending all this money, blood, and treasure overseas when we could solve our national security problems very easily by basically just dealing with the enemy within? Right. It's always the idea that there's this enemy within, this secret cabal, and I think that's kind of what you're seeing a lot of in response to this the quote-unquote ground zero mob.
So are you suggesting that, during the time of the rise of McCarthy, we were not at physical war, but we were in the middle of a Cold War that was, a massive military building. Is that
Well,
what you're talking about?
actually, yeah, but it was also.
Or do you think it's post-World War II?
Korea. Remember, Korea starts in the summer of 1950,
Right.
and which Americans are terrified by the confluence of the Soviets getting an atomic bomb, the China falling to communism in the 1949, and then North Korea invading the South, which leads the U.S. to be at war for 4 years from 1950 to 1954. So. It's that sense, but the interesting thing about McCarthy himself was McCarthy was not actually really in favor of big U.S. troop deployments abroad. He kept on saying we can avoid all of this if we just deal with traitors at home. They're the real problem.
Right. I find it very interesting. I mean, this is a clip from Dwight Eisenhower's 1952 run for president. And this is a Republican running for president of the United States. Listen to this.
He has met Europe's leaders, has got them working with us. Elect the number one man for the number one job of our time. November 4th, vote for peace. Vote for Eisenhower. A paid film.
Vote for peace. A Republican.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, Eisenhower, historians have looked much more kindly on the Eisenhower presidency in recent decades, and one of the fascinating things about Eisenhower was that he comes in 1952. The country's been at war in Korea for 2 years, and it's in some ways there's some analogies to Afghanistan. A lot of people on the right, in particular, want to escalate the war in Korea. To say, you know what, let's go and take the fight
they wanted
to
to
the
go
north.
all the way to Beijing.
Exactly, go all the way
In
to
fact,
Beijing.
what's his name? The crazy general wanted to use nukes.
That's why he was fired, because Douglas MacArthur wanted to make it a war exactly, to take over all of North Korea, go right up to the Chinese border.
Right.
And Eisenhower, who was an old soldier himself, he says, I will go to Korea if elected, and I will make peace. He does go to Korea. He flies there. As an old general, he looks at the terrain. He realizes that there's not a snowball's chance in hell that the United States could ever win that war, and he ends the war. And in fact, he doesn't start any new wars for 8 years during the height of the Cold War. And so that's actually why I think Eisenhower has gone down in history as actually one of the more successful Cold War
I think
presidents.
him and Jimmy Carter are the only two presidents that you could say that of.
I think that's I mean, actually, one interesting thing about Ronald Reagan is that Ronald Reagan didn't actually start a lot of wars.
Well,
either.
Grenada. He
did Grenada. He intervened briefly in Beirut, but then pulled the troops out. The truth is that the period we're in today, with the wars that Bush launched, I think are actually historically anomalous in terms of how willing the American foreign policy elite was to basically get us involved in ground wars. Historically, there's been more.
Well, there's a parallel with Vietnam, isn't there?
Yes, and Vietnam also came about, I think, at a period in which American leaders decided basically that our power was virtually unlimited, and I think that was and that we had virtually a blank check to run our foreign policy. I think that was a similarity between the Bush era and the kind of Kennedy-Johnson era.
We have just a half a minute left. We're talking with Peter Beinart, newamerica.net, the website, senior political writer for the Daily Beast. What can Americans do to push back on this new McCarthyism, this Islamophobia?
I think I think the basic quality that's completely missing, besides any knowledge, right? Most people just know jack about Islam; they know nothing about Islam. It's just some basic sense of empathy, some basic ability to put yourself in the position of somebody else. Many Muslims were too afraid to go and celebrate the end of Ramadan because they figured if people saw them in a public place celebrating, they would be subject to attack. I mean, why it is that people can't, at a basic human level, as people who want to practice our religion, identify with that and feel that as Americans we have a solidarity with those people is really beyond me.
Yeah, well, that's what we need to do. I mean, the celebration of Ramadan should be as highly considered as a celebration of Christmas.
Absolutely. It's part of what America should be about.
That's right. Peter Beinart, newamerica.net, and the Daily Beast, of course, dailybeast.com. Peter, thanks, and check out his new book, The Icarus Syndrome. It's brilliant. Peter, thank you for dropping by.
Thank you.
Good talking with you. For more on this and other topics, please visit thomhartmann.com.